Good evening and welcome. I'm Joy Bowman, Professor of African History and Associate Dean in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. It's my honor to welcome you to the 2023 James Baldwin Lecture. We are broadcasting from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Patumquet Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community and made possible through the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sold portions of land from 82 Native nations to fund the building of land-grant universities, including UMass Amherst. We begin with this acknowledgement and recognition that we must do more to repay the debt owed to these nations. This lecture honors the late James Baldwin, one of the most significant writers of the 20th century. Baldwin taught at UMass and in the 5 colleges for several years and continues to be an inspiration for many of us. This Baldwin lecture is co-presented by the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, the History Department, and the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. We thank History Department alumnus Dr. Alan J. Davis, class of 1968, for establishing this Baldwin lecture. Each iteration of this endowed lecture explores issues connected to social, economic, and racial justice. Tonight's lecture is also part of UMass's recognition of Black History Month, the cross-campus celebration of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday, and the 2022-23 Feinberg series, Confronting Empire, presented by the Department of History and its partners. I encourage you to visit the Feinberg series website to view recordings of past events and register for future events, including the next major event on March 7th. It will focus on revolutionary feminist resistance to US sanctions and embargoes. We also invite you to join us for a follow-up Zoom discussion on Monday, February 27th, centered on a piece of writing by Dr. Du Bois and presented by UMass's W.E.B. Du Bois Center. Our speaker tonight will be in attendance for this discussion on Monday, February 27th. You can find more details about these offerings in the chat box, along with information on how to turn on live closed captioning and how to listen to tonight's event in Spanish. The names of the many collaborators whose efforts made this event possible are listed there as well. If you are interested in attending this event as part of a class, you will also want to look at the chat box for a link to our sign-in sheet. Before we would begin, I would like to pay tribute to our beloved colleague, Professor John Bracey, who passed recently. His presence at UMass over the past 50 years helped to transform our campus and the lives of thousands of students, both in and out of the classroom. He will be sorely missed, but his legacy will live on through his students who continue the hard work of social justice and transformation that he so passionately fought for during his life. Today's Boston Globe has a powerful article on Professor Bracey and the UMass initiative that he began. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Yolanda Covington Ward, Chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies, who will introduce tonight's James Baldwin lecturer, Mr. Bill Fletcher, Jr. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bowman, for this gracious introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yolanda Covington Ward. I'm professor and chair of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies here at UMass Amherst. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed lecturer today, Mr. Bill Fletcher, Jr. And in the spirit of recognizing that Mr. Fletcher Jr. is both an activist and a scholar, I wanted to also hold up our late scholar and late colleague, Mr. John H. Bracey Jr. as well, as someone who also embodied this spirit of scholar activism that we see Mr. Fletcher showing us today. Bill Fletcher Jr. has been an activist since his teen years. in fact, entering the labor movement after graduating from college. And over the years, he's been engaged in workplace and community struggles, as well as on several electoral campaigns. He has worked for several labor unions, in addition to serving as a senior staff person with the AFL-CIO. He's the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and has led several other projects as well. He's a co-author of the Indispensable Ally, Black Workers in the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. He's also a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator as well. After Mr. Fletcher's lecture, he'll be joined by Toussaint Lossier, who's an associate professor in the Department of Afro-American Studies, for a lively Q&A guided by your questions, which we invite you to submit through the Q&A form linked in the chat and on your flyer that you received for this event. Thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Bill Fletcher Jr.
Greetings and thank you, Professor Covington Ward. I want to thank everyone at the university for this incredible honor of addressing you today. Speaking at a program named in honor of James Baldwin is humbling and flattering at one and the same time. In addition, today being the 155th anniversary of the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois makes this a very special honor. Dr. Du Bois was a very close friend and associate of my great-grandfather, the renowned pre-Harlem Renaissance poet, author, and anthologist, William Stanley Braithwaite. That makes today even more emotionally compelling for me. I want to begin by offering my condolences on the passing of Professor John Bracy. I had been unaware of his illness and was hoping that on this trip, I might have an opportunity to meet with him. His iconic stature and immense contribution shall be remembered and cherished. I want to dedicate my remarks to the late Dr. Roderick Bush, who for years was at St. John's University. Rod, as I knew him, was a committed social justice activist and scholar. It was with Rod that I had years ago some of my first discussions about this category called Black internationalism. Rod was an important comrade in the construction of the Black Radical Congress. He was taken from us far too early and is very much missed. I also wish to thank your own Professor Ernest Allen. Though I do not think that I have seen him in the flesh in decades, over the years he and I have corresponded, and particularly through his work on the pro-Japanese movement in the United States prior to World War II, I gained an important insight into the complexity of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. In fact, his research becomes a very important component of the story that I wish to tell. In order to address the category of Black anti-imperialism, one must start with the larger category of Black internationalism. The former is a subset of the latter. Any discussion of one without the other will become hollow. Therein lies the rub. What precisely is Black internationalism? What I discovered in preparing this presentation is that addressing this overall subject would necessitate more than the time allotted. Therefore, my focus runs primarily from the late 18th century until the late 1960s. There is so much to cover after 1970, and it goes beyond what I have time to address. There are many significant articles and books on this overall subject, which I can reference later. Before providing my version of an answer, let me suggest that this matter of the nature of Black internationalism is far from an academic question. To begin with, there is a history of US African-American engagement in the international arena that dates to the 17th century. And to be clear, my talk will focus on US African-American experiences with Black internationalism, since looking at this subject from the standpoint of the entire African world would be a task far beyond both my capacities and my allotted time. That said, in 1994, the contradictions of Black internationalism and Black anti-imperialism in the US became available for the entire world to see. 1994 was the year of South Africa's liberation. There's little doubt that US African Americans played a key role in building and sustaining a movement in solidarity with the South African freedom struggle. And we celebrated liberation. In fact, much of Black America saw the anti-apartheid liberation struggle in South Africa and the earlier national liberation struggles in Zimbabwe and Namibia to have been almost extensions of our own struggle here in the US. The relationship between white minority rule and Jim Crow was visceral. 1994 was also the year of the Rwanda genocide and the extermination of nearly 1 million Rwandans, primarily Tutsis and their Hutu allies and friends, in an orchestrated atrocity led by a right-wing Hutu military in the context of a civil war. Nearly 1 million dead, and there was something close to silence in Black America, with some notable exceptions such as Randall Robinson, the founding president of Trans-Africa and Trans-Africa Forum. Truth be told, the Rwanda genocide made no sense to US African Americans, if not constituting an embarrassment. How, so many African Americans asked, or intimated, could two groups of Black people have this sort of conflict in which one group attempted to exterminate the other? In that moment, the complexities and contradictions of Black internationalism were evident because, among other things, there were differences over what it meant to be Black and what it meant to be an internationalist, let alone anti-imperialist. So let's start our story there. There is no consensus definition of Black internationalism or Black anti-imperialism. Michael West and Fernand Wilkins argue that it is a product of consciousness, that is, the conscious interconnection and interlocation of Black struggles across man-made and natural boundaries. Teresa Zakodnik situates it within what Edward Said called adversarial internationalizations. David Featherstone talks of it as a relationship of peoples and networks. Jake Hodder offers that it encompasses a vast level of overlapping identities, ideologies, and trajectories, each with a distinct history and geography. These various definitions are useful and help me clarify my own thinking. I would argue that Black internationalism is a multi-tenancy SEA, within Black America, containing numerous currents and maelstroms, which situates the US African-American freedom struggle in an international context and advances various forms of solidarity with struggles deemed to be in alignment. Therefore, Black anti-imperialism is a contradictory position, fundamentally rooted in a constantly evolving Black consciousness that holds a specific identification of the need for the masses of African Americans to embrace a practice that challenges imperialism, albeit with often contradictory and imprecise definitions as to who or what is imperialist. A strange analogy, and with no pun intended, is the Black Sea. Scientists discovered that the Black Sea is almost two seas, with fresh water at the bottom and seawater at the top. The two do not mix, but together they constitute what is known as the Black Sea. And while the two do not mix, they cannot be separated from one another. The implications of this are critically important because it means that both Black internationalism and Black anti-imperialism are not necessarily left-wing tendencies. They are, however, central, though frequently overlooked components of the Black American experience. Interestingly, when discussions of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism are raised, there is an implicit question as to when this current first emerged. Regularly, when we hear about 1967 and Martin Luther King's opposition to the Vietnam War and the SNCC's solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. Or in some cases, one will go back to the Garvey movement, the largest sustained mass movement in US African-American history. Black internationalism probably can find its origins in the era of the pirates. Linebaugh and Rediker, in their path-breaking work, The Many-Headed Hydra, indicate that hundreds of Africans were among the pirate crews that practiced a surprising level of democracy and egalitarianism, particularly considering the era. Such pirates were engaged in what can only be called wars of liberation against multiple empires and the establishment of pirate republics. These pirates took on empires, the slave trade, etc., and offered camaraderie to those who were maligned and marginalized, often including women. None of this is to suggest that any of this activity was ideologized, But in the 1600s, we can see the elements of a Black consciousness beginning to emerge. Nevertheless, it was rebellion that paralleled, though was distinct from slave revolts, and instead engaged in a multinational proletariat in opposition to emerging capitalism. Africans were central players in this drama, and I believe this is where the story truly begins. The rise of Black internationalism is linked with the rise of what can be called both Black consciousness and ultimately an African-American national consciousness that the outlines of which become clearer toward the end of the 18th century in the US. In post-1783 United States, Black internationalism emerged through the work of individuals such as Phyllis Wheatley, evangelist Rebecca Pratt, and of course, through the impact of the Haitian Revolution. Some of this proto-internationalism unfolded through missionary work and eventually abolitionist work that was internationalized by Africans in the US. And within the latter, there was a special and regularly ignored role of African women in helping to internationalize the cause of abolition. Unfortunately, the Haitian Revolution did not spark an Afro-Indigenous uprising in the United States, but it certainly scared the plantation owners and other segments of the US ruling class. That said, the Haitian Revolution became a beacon for Africans in the US and the Western Hemisphere as a whole. Haiti inspired revolutionary movements in the Caribbean and Latin America, and through sea-based networks of the time, word spread even in the US that there was another way for the African. During the 19th century, Haiti grew to be both a focal point for Black demands on the US state, as well as for some, a destination where many believed that they could continue to the building of a Black republic. A more clearly articulated Black internationalism and anti-imperialism became evident to me in reading about the resolutions of the Negro Convention movements covering the period of 1831 through 1864, though some writers have suggested as far as the 1890s as being the end of the convention movement. While these gatherings had largely a domestic focus, they also addressed the question of an international resolution to the African dilemma in the United States, including proposals for the migrations of North American Africans to Canada, as well as the establishment of colonies in Africa and the Caribbean. Yet what particularly struck me when I first stumbled upon information regarding the convention movement was something that I truly did not expect to see: reference to Ireland. It was in the proceedings of these conventions that I came across resolutions in favor of independence for Ireland from British colonial rule. This was the earliest example of transnational African-American Irish solidarity that I've uncovered. And flowing from these conventions came years, in fact, decades, of forms of solidarity expressed with the Irish liberation struggle, including such articulation by Marcus Garvey. As a side note, there were numerous examples of African-Irish solidarity within colonial America, such as the 1741 planned insurrection in the New York colony. But here was something that existed on an entirely different level. African-American solidarity with Ireland represented something far deeper than sentimentalism. Rather, it was a recognition of how much the two movements shared. Whether the convention participants were aware of it or not, the British colonization of Ireland was accompanied by not only the creation of a settler colonial state, but also the full elaboration of a form of systemic racial, racist oppression of the indigenous Irish, an oppression that the British fully ideologized. It was also the case that the Negro Convention movements had a considerable nationalist tendency that appears to have grown over the years. This may have further encouraged an alignment with the Irish freedom struggle and its own demand for national self-determination. Regardless, Ireland continues to appear in African-American politics through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, baffling many commentators who have had difficulty understanding the basis for such international solidarity. Black internationalism and anti-imperialism evolved in complicated directions toward the end of the 19th century, in part reflecting the aftermath of the overthrow of Reconstruction. On the one hand, we witnessed the growth of emigrationist movements, both those internal to the US subcontinent, such as the exodusers, African Americans who migrated west, as well as those that were increasingly focused on encouraging African Americans to leave the United States, the latter category including efforts led by people such as Martin Delaney and a growing number of African women's clubs groups. Emigration is a recurring theme in Black internationalism up until World War II. It constituted a strange combination of a demand for self-determination, a form of Zionist-like colonialism, and what Ernest Allen describes as millenarianism. In this sense, it was a conservative approach towards white supremacy in the US, and indeed globally, and not what I would describe as anti-imperialist. But it situated the US African-American struggle in an international context, a fact that became very evident with the rise of the Garvey movement of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. A side note that needs further exploration, but not today, is that Black internationalism was not displayed post-emancipation in the relationship between US African Americans and indigenous peoples of North America. While African Americans were not the principal perpetrators of aggressions against the indigenous, the moves west by exodusers did not question the fact that the land was already occupied. The Philippine-American War between 1899 and roughly 1910 was a transitional moment in the construction of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. The Spanish-American War of 1898 and the US war against the Filipino people was broadly opposed in the US. For many African Americans, however, the preceding Spanish-American War of 1898 was an opportunity to display patriotism in the aftermath of the defeat of Reconstruction and the growth of Jim Crow rule. But the Philippine-American War proved to be something quite different. There are probably several factors that contributed to this, most especially the naked aggression of the US and the objective of annexation. But it was also the overt racist nature of the war that became evident, especially to African-American troops who were deployed to the Philippines, a point documented in great detail by Paul Kramer in his essay, Race-Making Colonial Violence in the US Empire, the Philippine-American War's Race War, and by E. San Juan Jr. in his essay, African-American Internationalism and Solidarity with the Philippine Revolution. It was in this war that there were notable desertions and defections by African-American troops, most remarkably the case of David Fagan, a Black soldier who defected the Philippine Army, where he became an officer fighting the US aggressors. Coinciding with this moment was the conscious development of a Pan-African movement, beginning with the Pan-African Conference, organized in 1900 by Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams and held in London. Attending this conference was W.E.B. Du Bois, who would go on to lead in the first 4 Pan-African Congresses and play a significant role in the 5th Pan-African Congress. Pan-Africanism then arose largely outside of Africa and becomes a particular, though not exclusive, form of Black internationalism. That said, and with all due respect, Pan-Africanism has never cohered into one ideology. Rather, it is another current and vantage point, albeit a very significant one, within Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism are both frequently discussed in the context of individuals, and generally speaking, those individuals are male. Yet what becomes clear, as I earlier mentioned, is the reality that Black internationalist currents were both created and influenced by Black women. In the 19th century, this was mostly expressed through abolitionism, as well as a particular view of both missionary work and emigrationism. Ellen Craft and Sarah Parker brought the issue of abolition in the US to the British Isles, including to Ireland. Mary Ann Shadd Carey, the first Black newspaper women publisher and co-founder of the Colored National Labor Union, advocated for African-American emigration to Western Canada. Just as Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism evolved in the early decades of the 20th century, so too did the contributions of Black women. The final decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century carried 2 events which had great significance in the shaping of Black internationalism in later years, neither of which took place in the US. In 1896, the Italian defeat in the Battle of Adwa at the hands of Ethiopians led by Menelik II resonated in Black America and would ultimately have an impact on African-American responses to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The second development was the Russo-Japanese War, of 1904 and 1905. The Japanese victory, especially the spectacular naval victory in the Battle of Tsushima, sent shockwaves across the world, and particularly the colonial world. The fact of a colored race decisively defeating a European white power became a source of hope. Within Black America, growing interest in Imperial Japan took shape, a factor that would grow over the next 40 years and influence politics within Black America. Ernest Allen, referencing W.E.B. Du Bois, noted, quote, "It was not without cause that the defeat of Russia by Japan, as Du Bois later noted, would give rise to a fear of colored revolt against white exploitation on the part of the Western powers," unquote. The second decade of the 20th century was one of multiple transformations of Black America. Caribbean migration to the US largely began during the first decade of the century. Following from the earlier Cape Verdean migration to the US, the Cape Verdean migration brought about a significant demographic and political shift within Black America, which resonates to this very day. The commencement of World War I shut off European migration to the US, leading to a demand for new sources of labor from within the borders of the United States, thus resulting in internal migration of African Americans from the South and for Chicanos and Mexicanos from the Southwest to the major manufacturing centers of the North and Midwest. This population reallocation and destabilization contributed to various tendencies emerging within Black America, most importantly Garveyism, but also explicitly radical socialist and communist currents. An additional factor was World War I itself, once the US entered, and in which African American troops played a significant role. In fact, their participation, along with the entrance of Black workers into jobs and sectors that had previously been occupied exclusively by whites, contributed to the racial pogroms, referenced as race riots, unfortunately, carried out against African American communities around the country, primarily in the period 1917 to 1921. A new stage of the Black internationalism, Black anti-imperialism emerged in this moment. This included the Garvey movement, the efforts of the socialist and race man Hubert Harrison, which included but was not limited to his work with Garvey, the burgeoning Pan-African Congress movement in which Du Bois played a major role, and the efforts of the Black revolutionary left, such as the African Blood Brotherhood and later elements of the Communist Party. Though A. Philip Randolph was among the Black radicals of that era, his work largely focused on domestic issues, though some labor leaders and activists inspired by him would go on to play an important role as Black internationalists. There are a few points worth noting about this turbulent time in history. First, the conflicting tendencies that emerged at that point illustrates the lack of cohesion within categories such as Black internationalism and Black anti-imperialism. Those terms are overarching, and correctly so, because they unite these diverse tendencies based on their role in positioning the US African-American freedom struggle in an international context, and the postulating of the need for mutual forms of material and moral solidarity of those internationally who are victims of racist and/or national oppression. Second, the Garvey movement of the UNIA must be understood as a critical component of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism, though extremely contradictory. It had similarities to Zionism, millenarianism, even Peronism from Argentina and the similarity of their social base, and also to national democratic movements in the colonial world that were led by pro-capitalist forces. Time does not permit an in-depth explanation of all of these, but there's a few points worth noting. One, though Garvey condemned imperialism and sought an independent Africa, much like the European Zionist movement, he sought a potential arrangement with them, specifically the US and Britain, to support, in this case, a colonization for Western Hemispheric people of African descent to be located in Africa. Two, much like various independence and national democratic movements in the colonial world, the Garvey movement contained anti-imperialist forces, some of which were anti-capitalist, others which were not. Garvey was certainly pro-capitalist, despite his initial and ironic expressions of support for the Russian Revolution. Three, also much like pro-capitalist-led anti-imperialist and national democratic movements in the global South, such as Nasser's Egypt from 1955 to 1970, The Garvey movement periodically reined in, alienated, or eliminated its left-wing elements. Hubert Harrison ended up moving away from Garvey, and the African Blood Brotherhood was driven away. 4. Finally, both within the US and the Caribbean, Garveyism had multiple meanings, and it was not unusual for Garveyites to have multiple identities, including as trade unionists, religious figures, and even as communists. What I would call the Pan-African Congress movement that flowed from the 1900 Pan-African Conference was a very separate Black internationalist venture with which Du Bois is correctly associated. Du Bois's efforts were not grassroots-based, and the struggles between he and Garvey became highly destructive, even factoring in that there were major legitimate areas of disagreement that under the best of circumstances could not be easily resolved. The two had very different visions of a Pan-African movement in future. As Teresa Zakladnik has noted, in both of these movements, the significant contribution of women leaders have been frequently overlooked. This has included the work of Amy Jacques Garvey, the second wife of Marcus Garvey, who was the editor of the women's page of Garvey's paper, The Negro World. A ceaseless agitator on international issues and women's issues, she had a viewpoint that pushed the envelope on Garveyism as such. And while Garveyism had active roles for women, those roles were overall subordinate to male leadership. In Du Bois's circle during this period, the contributions of Jessie Fawcett, described by some as the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance, have been overlooked. The literary editor for The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP, she became the acting editor when Du Bois was in Europe following World War I and oversaw the publication of the issue of the magazine that gained the largest circulation. Fawcett emphasized the commonality of struggles such as those against Jim Crow segregation and South African colonialism. She also drew comparisons with the treatment of European Jews, Filipinos, Hawaiians, and Puerto Ricans. The spirit of the times encouraged additional Black internationalist currents. The International Council of Women of the Darker Races, which existed between 1922 and 1940, was founded by important luminaries within Black America, including Margaret Murray Washington, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary Church Terrell, and Mary McLeod Bethune. Though there was a representative from Sierra Leone, this proved to be essentially a US African-American project that focused on educational efforts internationally. Let me pause here to reemphasize a specific component of the Black internationalist and anti-imperialist tradition. As exemplified by Fawcett, a particular element of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism went beyond the question of Black folks or the African world. The seeds of this component can be found in the Negro Convention movement of the mid-19th century. This element would grow over the course of the 20th century, albeit with varying levels of controversy. What I shall identify as the left wing of Black internationalism did not restrict itself to finding commonality of struggles and interests to the African world. This was an approach demonstrated by Du Bois, as well as the African Blood Brotherhood and later Black communists in the second and third decades of the 20th century, and continuing through the work of many Black internationalists to this day. Even within the Pan-African Congress movement, as exemplified in the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, Britain, 1945, there was a sense of a broader internationalism and solidarity, as summarized by the words that Trans-African Forum would resurrect 57 years later. Quote, "We believe the success of Afro-Americans is bound up with the emancipation of all African peoples and also other dependent peoples and laboring classes everywhere," unquote. While it is certainly the case, as we shall mention shortly, that some non-left trends within Black internationalism embraced a broader internationalism, they did so in a strange and inconsistent manner, in contrast to the Black left. A left, center, and right split within the Black internationalist sea would continue throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, a point to which we shall return. As the Garvey movement, which at the leadership level could be described as center and right within the Black internationalist current, was both repressed as well as splintered, and with the growth of the communist left, Black internationalism and anti-imperialism further evolved. The most significant internationalist work of the Black left through the end of World War II was that conducted by African Americans in the communist left. The Black internationalism of the communist left was mainly manifested through their work in and around the Communist International, the Comintern, and affiliated projects and campaigns. Interestingly, it has been noted that many of the first people of African descent, Blacks from the US and the Caribbean, attracted to the Communist Party USA, saw themselves as joining an international movement against racism, imperialism, and for socialism. In effect, they saw themselves as joining the Comintern, an international body that was close to 20 years, that for close to 20 years elaborated its own Pan-African vision. With that as context, it's easier to understand the relative or initial tolerance of many of the early Black members of the CP for the challenges and problems in the early CP, specifically the ambiguity to ambivalence within the early CP when it came to tackling racism and national oppression. These African-American communists saw the Comintern as what they were actually joining. The CP just happened to be here. The growing attention to what came to be known as the national question during the 1920s further encouraged US African-American members, though it is not entirely clear how close they were informed or engaged with some of the major internal battles in the Comintern itself concerning the global ramifications of the national question, such as the struggle initiated by the Tatar Muslim communist Mir Said Sultan Galiev, or that initiated by the Indian communist M.N. Roy. What we do know is that US African-American communists and Caribbean communists played a major role in clarifying and articulating a view on the African-American national question, as well as engaging in varying levels of anti-colonial work, such as the work of poet Claude McKay, that led by the iconic Trinidadian communist George Padmore, who would later leave the Comintern, as well as the work of Dutch Guyanese and British Guyanese couple Otto and Hermina Hugheswood. That story for another time. During the 1920s, the Garvey movement, faced with repression as well as internal turmoil, began to disintegrate. Coming out of this slow-moving fragmentation were different secular and religious tendencies that shared an emigrationist orientation with Garveyism, and in some cases, an apocalyptic vision of the future, a vision in which Black America could achieve liberation. By the 1930s, a split in Black internationalism began to appear in connection with developments in Asia, though the split was not an easy left-right demarcation. A second major influence on Black internationalism in the 1930s was, of course, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. As Ernest Allen pointed out in two significant articles concerning the pro-Japanese movement in the US prior to 1945, pro-Japanese sentiment within Black America continued to rise and spread in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War. Though by the early 1930s, Allen asserts that there was to be evidence that the Japanese government had taken an active interest in fostering a pro-Japanese sentiment among US African Americans, the movement itself was quite indigenous. Through formations such as the development of our own, that's what it was called, and the Pacific movement of the Eastern world, as well as myriad other formations, pro-Japanese sentiment was a form of anti-imperialism very much centered on an erroneous, though compelling, assessment of the nature of the Japanese empire, plus the adoption of the Japanese rhetoric to the effect that they were leading the charge against Western imperialism. This sentiment influenced a range of forces from the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad to W.E.B. Du Bois himself. As Allen pointed out, in 1937, the same year of the horrific Japanese rape of Nanjing, Du Bois applauded the alleged social achievements of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, known as Manchuria, though other Black leftists such as Langston Hughes vehemently disagreed. Ignoring or downplaying the pro-Japanese movement and sentiment, as did many members and leaders of the Communist Party, such as Harry Haywood, was dangerous on multiple levels, not the least being that within the pro-Japanese sentiment was a kernel of a demand for self-determination and liberation from white supremacy. Yet at the heart of this movement was a belief that the Japanese would actually liberate Black America, almost akin to a religious cult-like view of deliverance, and a sentiment that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Some pro-Japanese sentiment and motion was blunted by the US African-American response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Warning of white racial extinction and driven by a desire to avenge the defeat of 1896 and secure an expanded Italian empire, Benito Mussolini led Italy into a war of aggression, using superior firepower plus chemical weapons as a means of defeating the Ethiopians. For reasons that escape me, US African-American response to this aggression is underrated by many observers. This is odd considering the active response of the Black press and demonstrations such as the multiracial march in New York on August 3rd, 1935, with 25,000 New Yorkers marched against the aggression. Numerous organizations were formed in response, including the Ethiopia Research Council and the Provisional Committee for the Defense of Ethiopia. Students were mobilized, including through the Universal Ethiopian Students Association. Some volunteers, including 2 African-American pilots, went to Ethiopia, plus material support was organized, something noteworthy in that the US was suffering the Great Depression. Forces on the Black left worked to develop a clear narrative regarding the Italian invasion, centering themselves on the question of colonialism and fascism. Even in the face of an ambiguous stand by the Soviet Union at the time, the Black left, including its communist component, did not collapse but remained adamant in its opposition to the invasion. Some fragmentation began to emerge within the Black internationalist left in the aftermath of the Italian invasion, but not because of that invasion. By the late 1930s, a change in the position of the Comintern on the question of the need for a broad united front against fascism was used as justification by the Stalin regime and by several communist parties in the global north for downplaying the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle. By no means was this view adopted by all communist parties, but it was utilized by George Padmore, one of the leading Black communists at the time, in order to break with the Comintern, though the circumstances of his split appear to be a bit more complicated. There was growing concern among African Americans within the CP that some of the Popular Front orientation was being used to downplay the anti-racist struggle, though the CP continued to make major inroads within Black America generally and the Black working class in particular. It's important to note here that African American communists did not see any necessary contradiction between being an internationalist and a nationalist, and between being anti-fascist while also being anti-colonial. Audley Moore, later known as Queen Mother Moore, was a case in point, serving as a leader of the CP while also retaining her membership in the Garviate UNIA. Communists such as Moore, Abner Berry, and others objected to suggestions that the anti-colonial and anti-racist fight should be postponed. This critique was summarized in George Padmore's post-Comintern commentary on the Spanish Civil War, quoted by David Featherstone, where Padmore noted, and I quote, "The sympathy of Africans and other colonial peoples naturally goes out to the toiling masses of Spain in their heroic struggle against fascist barbarism, for they have not forgotten Abyssinia. And precisely because of this, it is so regrettable that democratic Spain, by failing to make an anti-imperialist gesture to the Moors, played into the hands of Franco. This should be a reminder to the European workers that no people who oppresses another people can themselves be free," unquote. By the 1930s, the communist left opened opportunities for US African Americans to engage on a global scale that had frequently been denied them. Individuals such as Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper, Eslanda Robeson, and later Shirley Graham Du Bois were among those many women and men who participated in international gatherings, helped build international solidarity movements, spoke out and wrote about the global issues of injustice. Numbers of US African Americans also volunteered to fight in Spain against the fascists as part of the international brigades, including African American women. The aftermath of World War II created a surprising, challenging moment for Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. Pro-Japanese sentiment had largely been silenced or crushed, but the anti-West anger had only increased in part through the global expectations that the defeat of the Axis powers should open the gates to decolonization and a genuine democratization of the so-called liberal democracies. Organizations such as the Council on African Affairs, led by Du Bois and Paul Robeson, exited the World War II moment with vehement attacks on Western colonialism, particularly vis-a-vis Africa and the Indian subcontinent. The Fifth Pan-African Congress helped to crystallize the African demands for independence, but also linked those demands with the struggles of people of African descent, as noted. Black internationalism and anti-imperialism, however, ran into a very white and very strong wall beginning around 1946. The advent of the Cold War, initiated by Britain and the United States, became a major means to crush internal dissent, as well as strengthen regimes favorable to US policies. In some cases, this meant supporting colonial powers in opposition to liberation movements, such as in French Indochina, while in other cases, the US conditionally supported independence movements as long as they did not stray too closely toward the Soviet Union. Black internationalism and anti-imperialism began to break down into at least three major currents. One, that which was influenced by the communist left. Two, the non-communist and anti-communist left. And three, the religious apocalyptic element, such as the Nation of Islam, the latter probably the chief surviving element of the pro-Japanese movement. Through repression, red baiting, and isolation, the pro-communist left was significantly weakened on all fronts, including within the realm of internationalism. Sections of Black internationalists continue to find a home in efforts such as Henry Wallace's 1948 presidential campaign, within the Council on African Affairs, the Civil Rights Congress, and other efforts that sought to bridge the gap between domestic and international issues. As noted by Eric McDuffie, two leftists, Louise Thompson Patterson, and soon-to-be major actress Beulah Richardson, later known as B. Richards, formed the Sojourners for Truth and Justice in 1951 to organize left and progressive Black women in the struggles for domestic and international justice. The pro-communist Black internationalists were far from hegemonic, even at their height. Almost immediately after World War II, an assortment of both non-communist and anti-communist Black internationalists emerged. Individuals such as Bayard Rustin and Maida Springer Kemp are two such examples. Coming out of different movements but fusing in internationalism, what is most interesting about this current is its own notion of anti-imperialism, yet its willingness at certain moments to block with anti-communist forces. In the cases of both individuals, there appears to have been a sincere desire to support, at least in Africa, national independence and some form of social liberation. But as noted by Jake Harder in connection with Rustin, there was an additional desire to expand US global influence. Rustin specifically sought to build ties between the US peace movement and the emerging leaders in the global South, in some cases suggesting that the pacifist road was one that all independents should follow. Black internationalists in the 1940s and 50s found other homes, such as in support for the freedom struggle, the South African freedom struggle. William Sutherland and Bayard Rustin were instrumental in the American Committee on Africa, one of the earliest post-Council on African Affairs formations to take on the anti-apartheid struggle. Black pacifists are often able to walk, or were often able to walk the line between the more anti-communist Black internationalists and those in the more radical left in the global South. To do so, however, meant being very cautious regarding one's attitude towards socialism, the Soviet and Chinese projects, and non-alignment. The third current worth mentioning is the Nation of Islam. This may appear at first glance to be odd, but the repression of left-wing Black internationalism in the late 1940s and 1950s, coupled with the popular white derogatory portrayal of Africa, undercut many efforts at Pan-African solidarity within the US. Matters of class could not be discussed, even the US trade union movement, without allegations of communist sympathies. Addressing matters of class externally, as well as suggestions of US foreign policy, was anything other than angelic, led to repression. This repression skewed discussions of international affairs, as many commentators have noted, including Penny Van Eschen in her book on the Council on African Affairs, Race Against Empire. Africa was presented and seen in the US through racial lens. African Americans frequently viewed Africa through our own experiences and our encounters with a particular form of white supremacist national oppression here in North America. Skewing and suppressing discussions of Africa, colonialism, and imperialism, largely as a result of repression, meant that a niche was open for a critical commentary within Black America on US foreign policy generally, and US foreign policy vis-a-vis Africa in particular. Herein entered the Nation of Islam, which mixed a bizarre origin myth of the supposedly Asiatic Black man, a notion shared with the Moorish Science Temple of America of Noble Drew Ali, a millenarian view of the future of Black people, a deep hatred of the West, and an adamant abstentionism from real-world politics. Yet contained in Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper of the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm X helped to found, were articles on conditions and struggles in the colonial and semi-colonial world, as well as the domestic coverage. The paper combined religious commentary with leftist and Black nationalist analysis and news coverage. It was through Muhammad Speaks that thousands of US African Americans could get a sense of the broader world and recognize that the US African American struggle was not conducted in isolation. An important development in Black internationalism that arose, declined, and then reemerged was that in connection with opposition to nuclear weapons. Vincent Intandi does an excellent job explaining and analyzing the efforts taken in opposition to nuclear weaponry, beginning almost as soon as the United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This was a movement in which both the communist and non-communist left were engaged and where African Americans provided significant leadership and presence, though are regularly ignored. Key figures in this movement included Bayard Rustin, Lorraine Hansberry, and surprisingly for some, Coretta Scott King. This movement was both domestic and international and came under severe repression from the US government. Pacifist internationalists such as Bayard Rustin believed strongly in the connection between opposition to nuclear weapons and opposition to colonialism. He did not restrict his criticisms to the US, but engaged others in taking on the French, who carried out nuclear tests in Africa, tests that riled African independence movements. Intandi notes that by 1951, the first wave of this anti-nuclear movement was largely crushed, but it slowly reemerged later in the 1950s and early 1960s and came to include proponents such as Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. Black internationalism further morphed as the 1960s progressed. Black internationalists influenced by the Communist Party continued engagement with Soviet-influenced international left, but also worked around nuclear weaponry and anti-colonialism. One of the challenges for the CP-influenced Black internationalists was the sectarianism of the Communist Party itself, manifested in multiple ways, not the least being which international movements they would choose to support, those to oppose, and those to ignore. National liberation movements and national populist projects, to borrow a term from Samir Amin, who were close to the Soviet Union, were those to be supported. Those either aligned with the Chinese or going in a different course were to be either opposed or ignored. The sectarian approach weakened the credibility of the CP among Black internationalists, as they often came to be seen as instruments of pro-Soviet agenda rather than as advocates for a left-wing Black internationalism. Contending approaches included the non-communist and anti-communist forces, such as Rustin, though Rustin's engagement declined as he focused more attention on domestic US issues, ultimately leading him to criticize Martin Luther King's public statements against the Vietnam War. Rustin and the previously mentioned Maida Spring Kemp, tried as they might, were unable to sustain a legitimate pole representing anti-colonialism and anti-communism. Black internationalism in the 1960s came to be shaped by forces around two iconic figures, Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. The views of both individuals shared much in common, contrary to the mainstream narratives we frequently hear. Malcolm X, though groomed by the Nation of Islam, went far beyond the NOI in his internationalism. Mixing history with analysis of current events, Malcolm seemed to radiate Black internationalism, being as concerned and emotionally linked to struggles in the Congo as he was struggles in Cuba or Mississippi. But Malcolm did not restrict himself to the African world, being one of the first and foremost critics of the US aggression in Vietnam and Laos. Malcolm's pre-64 view of Black nationalism, however, clashed with his Black internationalism, a point Malcolm himself acknowledged but never fully interrogated. This became apparent to him when he visited Africa and met a North African revolutionary who was apparently light-skinned. The North African asked Malcolm what his Black nationalism had to say about someone like him, the North African. This pushback, for lack of a better term, appears to have contributed to Malcolm's rethinking of the revolutionary project he was attempting to construct and what it would mean both domestically and internationally. King's internationalism was not something that emerged out of the air in 1967, but was truly central to his being during the 1950s. A committed pacifist, though according to one observer, not as visceral as his wife, he was prepared to side with anti-nuclear forces. Yet King's internationalism was not something that he wore on his sleeve until 1966. It was largely as a result of the victories in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that the moral and strategic questions surrounding the international situation arose. And it was also the case that the US escalation of its aggression in Vietnam made it that much more difficult to avoid. King spent his final year attempting to operationalize his internationalism. As frequently happens with Black people, when we stray outside of acceptable racial parameters, we're accused of being everything but a child of God. King was attacked by friend and foe alike for being erratic and unfocused, though the chief criticism was attention to US aggression overseas. It was the case, though, that King was either unable or unwilling to make the Southern Christian Leadership Conference an instrument for Black internationalism. Nevertheless, his vitriolic attacks on the role of the US internationally confounded many of his liberal allies, such as Bayard Rustin, who believed that it would threaten King's leadership of a movement for domestic justice. Similar such criticisms were lodged against SNCC when it came out against the Vietnam War, and when in June '67 it supported the cause of the Palestinian people. Liberal and conservative pundits alike argued that Black people, including but not limited to Dr. King, should stay focused on issues that they knew something about. Apparently, international issues did not fit the bill. Despite the documented history of US African-American engagement with international issues, all too often the commentaries by mainstream white sources are colored with surprise and outrage. But it's not just white sources. The impact of this battering that we receive has affected many Black public figures who quite literally fear speaking out on international issues of the day unless they receive the proper approval from the whites, a problem I directly encountered in Trans-Africa. I've run sort of over time, and I have to apologize. And it's this reason that I said earlier that I can't go further historically, bringing it up to the present. In that light, I'd like to identify a few summary points, if you'll forgive me. One, integral to when we're talking about Black internationalism and anti-imperialism, the first point, it's integral to the domestic Black freedom struggle, yet it's regularly alienated. In large part, I chose to focus on the pre-70 period because it is generally overlooked in discussions about Black internationalism. But I also focused here to emphasize that Black internationalism is not a new sea, but one that has been a central component of the larger Black American experience in one form or another since we were brought to these shores. It was not invented by Garvey, Malcolm, or Martin Luther King. It was not invented by Amy Jacques Garvey, Claudia Jones, or Jesse Fawcett. It has been a combination of an act of resistance plus a framework in order to both understand white supremacist national oppression, as well as a lens through which to contemplate the necessary strategic and tactical alliances in order to gain freedom. As such, Black internationalism and anti-imperialism exists as a playing field on which there are contending views regarding the path to freedom. Two, it is multi-tendency. Black internationalism, though having a general definition, comes to be defined in the real world through its practitioners. It exists as a big tent, but one within which there is a constant battle for hegemony, whether the battle is direct or indirect. We see this today, for example, in the struggle that exists regarding how to respond to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, with some Black internationalists siding with Russia, or at least being silent about Russia, while others, such as yours truly, standing firmly with the Ukrainian people. It's not that one side or the other are false Black internationalists. Rather, there is a tumultuous struggle underway. To a great extent, that is what Ernest Allen identified after discovering the pro-Japanese movement of the 30s and early 40s. Three, it can be influenced, Black internationalism can be influenced by the enemy of my enemy is my friend notion. One of the most difficult decisions that any movement faces is how to identify one's allies and how to understand the nature of one's opponents. The notion of the enemy of my enemy is my friend is one framework that has haunted the Black freedom movement. The growth of the pro-Japanese movement in the 30s reflected an analysis not only as to the nature of the enemy, but also of our enemy's enemies. It represented a tragic misanalysis of this question, resulting in a downplaying of the dangers inherent in certain alliances. The fact that our enemy has opponents is both logical and inevitable. The question remains as to under what conditions a progressive movement chooses to ally with our enemy's enemies. The answer lies in a question posed by Lenin: who stands to gain? And further, what are the terms and conditions of a potential alliance? Four, US African Americans have often viewed the international arena as if it was an extension of our domestic arena. One of the most significant challenges to the Black freedom movement, generally and Black internationalists specifically, has to do with the tendency to extrapolate from our experiences facing white supremacist national oppression in the US and apply them in analyzing other struggles internationally against racism and imperialism. The particularities of our experience in the US cannot serve as a basis for understanding struggles in Brazil, Colombia, Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, Algeria, South Africa. Understanding the particularities of contradictions distinguishes ideological discussions from political discussions. It also helps one understand the nature of potential enemies and friends. In the case of South Africa, for instance, the contradictions between the African National Congress and the Inkatha Freedom Party in the early 1990s were often relegated by many of us to contradictions between the forces of good versus the forces of evil, rather than understanding the social basis of the two distinct political movements and the multiple issues at stake. The South African freedom struggle was not an international aspect of the US African-American struggle. It was an allied struggle against a similar though different opponent in a vastly different environment. 5, a minority sentiment. Black internationalism is a minority sentiment that is often counterposed to domestic considerations. Despite the historical legitimacy of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism within Black America, there is a constant tension between forces that wish to downplay the international in favor of the national. King was up against this in the 1960s, as we noted. It has arisen time and again. I am deeply engaged, for example, in solidarity with the Sahrawi people's struggle for self-determination in Western Sahara against the Moroccans, yet I am constantly challenged that this struggle is irrelevant, allegedly, to the US African Americans and domestic concerns. Black internationalism, as noted by Jeffrey Brown, has largely focused on the global struggle around rights, frequently disconnected from any material interest the US African Americans might have in such struggles. While I do not accept all of Brown's conclusions, he is pointing towards a need to build a different sort of solidarity. Finally, Black internationalism faces a strategic and ideological quandary in the 21st century. The lengthy struggles against colonialism, white minority rule, and Jim Crow segregation have ended the struggles for national self-determination, full equality, against patriarchy, and for environmental justice persist. The reality of this shift places before Black internationalists new challenges: how to address crises such as the Rwanda genocide, the uprising against Assad in Syria, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and indeed the rise of global right-wing authoritarian movements, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the counter-revolution against women and gender non-conforming populations are completely different than the conditions and issues that shaped the initial development of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. The opponent cannot be easily identified based on skin color, sex, or country of origin. In fact, many egregious policies are implemented, if not conceptualized, by peoples of the once referenced darker races. This leaves us with a question of whether Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. I shall end with that question and with only one hint. It necessitates a different paradigm about the nature of our oppression and the nature of systems of global oppression. Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? Thus began a critically important essay written nearly 100 years ago when a new revolutionary movement in the semi-colonial world was emerging. And these two questions are the ones that confront Black internationalism and anti-imperialism today. Thank you. Or perhaps I should say, to be continued. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to, on behalf of the committee involved in planning the James Baldwin lecture, I just want to, as an associate professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, thank Bill Fletcher Jr. for his talk. And while we can't be in the in person to kind of hear the applause from the audience, want to pass along our appreciation for what you've given us today. Want to open things up for question and answer, but want to do so first and foremost by thanking Jess Johnson from the History Department for her tireless work in helping to put this event together. And want to give, perhaps before we really dig into the audience questions, Bill Fletcher, want to just give you an opportunity for you to kind of highlight what you might identify as being one of the most important items that you'd like our students, particularly our undergraduate students, and those who might be new to, or let's say at least less familiar with the concepts of Black internationalism and anti-imperialism. What is a core theme or idea that you'd like those in the audience to walk away from just following your talk?
Thank you for that, Hassan. I would say that it's critical that progressive people are consistently anti-imperialist and anti-authoritarian. And that we cannot afford to be hoodwinked by catchy slogans and rhetoric, because hiding behind that can often be incredibly repressive regimes. And during the 20th century, there were many of us on the left that were prepared to ignore real problems that were committed either in countries that were supposedly on a progressive road or social movements. We were prepared to put various struggles on hold, particularly the struggle against male supremacy, and claim that at some later point we'd come back to that. And can't do that. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't pass. So those are some of the main things that I would say in looking at today's world. It demands that we're much more analytic in looking at struggles, social movements, et cetera.
Wonderful. I appreciate that. I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. One of the first ones that we have here is specifically, again, kind of geared towards our some of the concerns raised by undergraduate students, that many of our students have a vivid memory of the George Floyd rebellions of 2020. What can people here in the US learn from anti-imperialist movements abroad to win police abolition in the United States?
That we have to be long distance runners as opposed to sprinters. That the fact of, or the failure to get an immediate victory does not mean that we're either right or wrong, but that we're going to have to prosecute a long-term struggle, which necessitates having strategy. And strategy is more important than rhetoric, but a narrative is central to strategy. In other words, explaining to people how different things fit together and how we anticipate winning. So one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and the uprisings and protests is that very little was built at the level of organization. There were tremendous demands, and we actually shifted public opinion. But in the absence of building institutions, building organization, and really keeping hold of the narrative, this started to slip. And we thus saw the counterattack led by people like Governor DeSantis and others that started to mock the demands and talk about this thing that they call wokeism. So we need to build organizations in order to secure victories. And that means strategies, and if you're going to win, it means building broad movements with allies. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're just creating a situation for a glorious defeat.
Appreciate that. Thank you. We've got a couple questions around the dynamics of what many have called Afro-Asian solidarity. One of them asking if you could say a little bit about what the solidarities look like in relationship to anti-colonial, anti-oppression movements in the 19th century. For instance, the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion and Afro-American coalitions in support of it. And similarly, one of the audience members, Cameron, was wondering about the non-aligned movement, specifically the Bandung the key role of the Bandung Conference and its impact on the U.S. Black freedom movement?
I'm going to answer that at a certain level of generality. So one of the things that we see after the Civil War is that Black-led movements, particularly in the working class, such as the Colored National Labor Union, embraced Asian workers. And this was in complete contrast to what the officialdom in the mainly white labor movement was doing at the time. And what I mentioned before about the African-American response to the Philippine-American War was another example of identifying with a struggle against white supremacy and against imperialism. And then, as I mentioned, this peculiarity of the pro-Japanese movement. But what's I think really noteworthy is that you see this sort of coming together, a recognition of a commonality of interests among what was called for a long time the darker races, the people of the global South, the people who are descendants of the global South, coming together. One representation of that was the Bandung Conference in 1955, and but there was also the excitement within Black America of independence struggles that were taking place in Asia and Africa, particularly. But then something happens in the 1970s, and so up through the 1970s, you have, like, for example, a lot of identification by Asian Americans with the African American freedom struggle. And not just the civil rights movement, but the Black Power movement, the revolutionary movements led by groups like the Black Panther Party. And something in the 1970s, there's a beginning of a degeneration towards what I'd call ethno-nationalism in a variety of social movements, and we see it around the world, but also in the United States. So, for example, it was not uncommon for people that we would currently identify as not Black to identify as Black. For example, people from South Asia, regardless of their skin complexion, in India, but also like in South Africa, in Britain, Caribbean, would identify as Black. And Black was seen as, in effect, the color of the racially oppressed. But then in the 1970s, it's like folks are not so sure. And they pull back from that, and you start to see much more of an identification with a particular ethnicity, including among African Americans, where we're talking about African Americans, and we're making, and it's not that that's wrong, but there's this way in which there's a particularization of our interests as opposed to recognizing a sort of coming together. I think part of this was also influenced by populations of the post-1965 immigration to the United States. People who came here who had a very different experience with white supremacy than pre-1965 people of color in the United States. And so a lot of the solidarity started to break down. And then you start to see competition, and we see it now in egregious forms, like, whether it's Asian Americans who are attacking affirmative action, or whether you see the growth of these right-wing Black nationalist groups like the American Descendants of Slavery, that basically argue that nobody has been oppressed like us, and that the only people that should be eligible for reparations are people of African descent who can prove their legacy to 1865 slavery, right? So I would argue that all of this is in the interest of our enemy, rather than in the interest of any of the oppressed.
Appreciate that. We've got a question from, and this is again, two questions that are kind of building on a common theme that you sort of gestured towards during the earlier part of your talk, but I think there's some degree of interest in. So David, a member of Veterans for Peace and an activist who's worked with the International Indigenous Initiative for Transformative Collaboration, would like to know if you can speak on any alliances of Black internationalists with Indigenous peoples in the US and or from around the world. And alongside that, we had a follow-up question just asking, what relationships do you see between Black internationalism and decolonization here in the United States, and the possibility of building solidarity across anti-imperial and anti-white supremacist movements within the borders of the United States itself. So I know that's like 4 questions in one, but kind of building on this point that you sort of articulated early on about some of the limitations around early Black migration movements in kind of failing to recognize some of the dynamics regarding the context in which their migration potentially failed to confront sort of the patterns of U.S. settler colonialism.
So historically, there has been, pre-1865, there were various acts of solidarity by Indigenous with African Americans, African slaves. And there was also slavery carried out by some Indigenous tribes against Africans. One of the best examples of solidarity were the Seminole Wars, because the Seminoles were essentially constituted by people from various tribes who escaped to Florida, which had been occupied at the time by Spain, as well as the entrance of African runaways. And so this was not like an ideological thing. It was people wanted to get away from slavery or get away from the folks that were moving against the Indigenous. And they joined together. And the Seminole Wars were not won by white America militarily. They were won by subterfuge. One of the reasons I made the point about what happens after 1865 with the Exodusters is that there are some people, particularly so-called Afro-pessimists, who basically like to act like African American people, Black people, particularly people of African descent, have been victims of everybody, that everybody has screwed us. And sometimes it makes us seem like we're pure. We're not. And so there were African Americans, former slaves, etc., that moved west and were prepared to grab land that wasn't theirs and to join the military to fight the Indigenous. So we've had a complicated relationship. During the 1960s and 70s, we start to see I'm talking only in the United States, that's all I can really focus on. We see a greater level of solidarity that gets built between Indigenous forces in the Black freedom movement, and particularly with the rise of the radical currents within both the African American movement and Indigenous movements. Groups like the Panthers, the AIM, the American Indian Movement, etc. That's when we start seeing this very visible example is solidarity. The repression against the Black left and against the left as a whole really drives a wedge in terms of that. It's not that the solidarity has disappeared. And so, for example, in Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns in '84 and '88, he was one of the people that was a very strong advocate for the indigenous in the United States. But the bottom line is that it's been inconsistent over time. And one of the things that needs to happen is that our peoples need to engage in historical discussion and not coming together with the assumption that one got screwed more than the other. But we've got to understand the way that we've been played, as well as the competition around resources, et cetera. Which goes to the second point, that the fundamental thing that people of color in the United States have to appreciate is that, well, fundamental things is that not one of our populations comes anywhere close to being the majority of the United States. Two, that while it is true that by the middle of the 21st century, there will probably be no one majority group as such. That by itself doesn't mean anything, because if you look at cases of white minority rule, particularly South Africa, you see that you can have apartheid systems, which is one of the big dangers here, where there is a hierarchy within which different peoples are slotted. The Spanish and the Portuguese did this in Latin America. The Spanish articulated it as Las Castas, right? In which they slotted different people depending on who they intermixed with and how much European blood they had, etc. And it became a very effective means to this day of keeping the poor, the marginalized and oppressed in Latin America fighting each other. You can have a situation in the United States where much the same happens, where significant portions of the Latino and Latina populations all of a sudden become christened white or proto-white or something else. The same with Asians. And so this is why politics can't be primarily about demographics. It's got to be about identifying a new majority.
No, I think that's really well put, and again, appreciate your attentiveness to the multiple questions that were posed. Want to follow up in part because I know we're running a little bit short on time. One, we've got a question from Shweta, who's a PhD candidate in UMass English department, who asks, can academic activists who protest against global Islamophobia and casteism, both in the US and beyond, collaborate with Black academic activists? And how important is that fight, or is that collaboration in the fight against the rise of the global right? And want to just pose that point alongside a question posed by another graduate student who's thinking about the comparisons of US African-American population and today's migrant population, and is wondering about the parallels that can be found in African-Americans' historic and current oppression with today's oppression of non-white migrants nationally and internationally. I just asked those two questions together because they both seem to be wondering about what comparisons or lessons can be drawn about thinking about the parallels between the struggles against casteism and Islamophobia alongside, or on one side, and on the other side, the oppression of today's migrants, particularly undocumented workers, and what perhaps beyond learning from the African American experience, what can be gained from collaborations by folks who are situated in addressing both of those struggles.
What's implicit in both questions is the need to fight for democracy, the expansion of democracy. I don't mean simply the right to vote, the democratization of all fields of life, culture, economics, politics, etc. So opposition to caste oppression, to Islamophobia is absolutely central to defeating the global right-wing authoritarianism, which I would argue is probably the greatest danger outside of the environmental catastrophe that we face right now. That and part of what the global right is doing is playing off different sectors against one another. So how can we understand, for instance, Black men who would vote for Trump? I mean, it just seems like a suicidal decision. And yet it's directly related to the way that the far right plays to misogyny and plays to anti-immigrant sentiment. How can we understand, the anti-affirmative action move led by segments of Asians, right? Well, part of it is that this is really a post-1965 issue, and it is competition for limited resources. So we've actually got to call these issues out. So the first, in terms of the first part of the question, or first question, I'd say it's critical that this is a discussion that engages Black internationalists. And it goes back to what I'd say is the left wing of Black internationalism, which is not only focusing on the African world, but looking at struggles against oppression around the world, particularly those that have to do with race, imperialism, etc. So absolutely, I would agree there. The issue of the migrants and African American, U.S. African Americans is very complicated because we didn't come here voluntarily. And this is even a source of tension between U.S. African Americans and Caribbean Blacks and migrants from Africa who come here and don't understand our experience with white supremacist national oppression. And so, it would be very common, for contentious discussions between U.S. African Americans and Caribbean Americans around, you U.S. African Americans aren't taking advantage of the opportunities you have. And U.S. African Americans saying, you Caribbeans, come here, you're looking down your nose at us, right? So one of the things that has to be understood by all groups is that we did not come here voluntarily, right? Just as the indigenous did not come here, did not ask to be put on reservations. This land was theirs. It was expropriated. And that makes our situations fundamentally different from anyone who comes here voluntarily. And so I'd say, Toussaint, people have got to get that. They really have to get that. And that doesn't mean that the experience of migrants who are persecuted is any less important. See, like when people talk about an immigration crisis, there is no immigration crisis in the United States. There's a crisis facing migrants from the global South. That's the crisis, because Russians, Ukrainians, Irish, they can come here illegally, and I don't know of many raids by ICE against those populations. I don't know of much being done about Russian women flying to Florida to have babies. but you get one Asian, one Latina that comes here and has a baby, and people are ready to bust apart and talk about what's being done. And so I think that the issue for migrants from the global South is one of race. And that's part of the discussion I think needs to happen with migrants from the global South, that about this issue of race and about what they're coming to in this country. Because there's a couple of lessons that are taught to all migrants that come here. And the most important being, stay as far away from African Americans and indigenous people as you can. And do not identify with them. Do what you can to distinguish yourself from them. And to the extent to which migrants, even migrants of color, accept one modicum of that notion, we're in trouble.
Well, I have a whole host of questions that I wish we had the time to ask. Particularly would be curious to hear more about your experience at Trans-Africa, and also some of the points that you articulated in regards to really the importance to an anti-imperialist, a sort of left anti-imperialism within the context of the broader Black liberation struggle. But we do need to close for the evening. I want to once again thank the organizers of tonight's event, particularly from the Afro-American Studies and History departments, as well as the Feinberg Lecture Series as a whole. And want to again flag for those in the audience that this coming Monday, the UMass Amherst W.E.B. Du Bois Center is going to be hosting a discussion of one of Dr. Du Bois's underappreciated essays regarding exactly this topic of anti-imperialism. And want to encourage folks to attend and continue to be in conversation with Bill Fletcher Jr. But most of all, I want to thank him for his time tonight, and thank all of you on the audience for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.